me to start?
Yes, so if I introduce Tony first.
Okay. All right, my name's Tony Story. I'm a senior lecturer at Northumbria Law School. Been there 26 years coming up. I teach criminal law to our first year students and a module called sports law to our third year students. And I'm the program leader for something called the Graduate Diploma in Law, which is a one-year program for anyone who's done a degree in anything but law, and they can then convert their, say, English or history degree into a legal qualification. Basically it, I guess.
Yeah, there was lots of questions around that about sort of getting into law if you haven't done a law degree or a law A level, but we'll get onto that. And
yep.
Martin?
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a magistrate. I've been a magistrate for over 20 years. And for those of you who don't know, magistrates don't get paid and they are volunteers. I know absolutely nothing about the law because I rely on people in the court, the prosecutor, the defence solicitor, and the legal advisor in the court. What I do is make a decision based on what is heard in the court. And that's myself and my two colleagues. We sit as a bench of 3 people in the court. And we make decisions. We're just normal people. I used to be a teacher. I must have been a really, really bad teacher because I taught Mr. Henson. But that's it. Anybody can be a magistrate, really, if you're between age 18 and 70. But I'm sure that there'll be some questions coming up in a minute.
Fabulous. So if we can go to question number 1, obviously, Martin, you alluded to there the fact that you've had no sort of legal experience or law training or law degree or anything. There's lots of people asking whether or not it's a requirement to do A-level law before you go on to do a degree at law. They've heard that some universities perhaps don't like you doing A-level law because you come with sort of preconceived ideas about it or sort of misinformation, if you would. But Tony, do you recommend that A-level law is a good start before doing a law degree, or can you get around it without doing it?
Well, if we get that question about is it a requirement, the answer is definitely no. I'm not aware of any British law school that makes it a requirement. Whether it's recommended, that's a different question entirely. Now, at Northumbria, we take a completely neutral policy. So we look for the grades from whatever subject students have done at A-level. So we don't require A-level law. We certainly don't distinguish between it and other subjects. It's all about the grades. I would guess about a third, maybe a half of our intake have done law. Obviously the others haven't. So when we kick off, and my module, my criminal law module is one of the very first subjects that students do. It's taught in semester 1 of year 1. And I always say in my very first lecture that we assume zero knowledge. So I say to the students, if you have done a law A-level or some other legal qualification, that's going to help you probably, I think, but we're not going to assume anyone has any prior knowledge. So if you're studying law for the very first time, if you're in week 1 of year 1, then we're not going to expect you to have studied law at all, and we'll take it from there. So I think it probably does help a little bit, maybe in the first year, because I guess people will typically be doing English legal system and either criminal law or tort if they're studying law at A-level. But I mean, there's lots of other subjects that students will be studying. Contract law is a typical first year module, and then when you get to second year, you're doing things like land law. No one's going to have studied them at A-level. So I think it might give you a little short-term boost, because there'll be some revision in your first year of your law degree, but you'll quickly find that within a few months, and certainly by the time you get to second year, everything will be completely new. And I think there is a potential downside as well if you have to. I mean, Daryl, you mentioned there, students might come in with preconceived ideas. I don't think that's a problem particularly. I think what might be a problem is complacency, actually. I think if students have done law at A-level, and they'll turn up, and certainly in my lectures, where they've done criminal law before, they might be thinking, oh, I've done this, I know this is easy. But I deliberately include things on the syllabus that students won't have done at A-level, just to, not to try and catch people out, but just to ensure that it's not all stuff they've already done before. So yeah, I would think, yeah, if you can do law, I think it helps, but there's just, God, be careful, don't get complacent.
Yeah.
Don't turn up at university thinking, oh, I've done this is going to be easy. So
I was catching up with Martin before we came online, and what you were saying there about throwing some curveballs in. I remember one of our first lectures I had with you, introducing R versus Brown and the conversations that eluded from that, and that's a completely different conversation for a different day,
yes.
I think.
Absolutely.
But Martin, do you think any sort of legal training would have given you a better stand in your job, or do you feel like you've been well equipped without sort of doing legal training?
I think it's any legal training. No, I don't think so, because we can rely on the professionals in the court. I think the important thing about being a magistrate is knowing what's going on perhaps in your own neighbourhood, because that's about what it's local justice, or supposed to be local justice. So you know your own neighbourhood, you know the people who are living there and what have you. I think doing something like an A-level will give you a context of what the law is, and perhaps will help you initially with the language of the law. But I'm continuing to learn as I go on all the time, and I think it's quite exciting because the law changes and the application of the law changes all the time. There isn't a month go by without me getting some sort of information about a different focus on the sentencing guidelines, or something perhaps to do with mental health or domestic violence, or just being able to utilise social media. There's a lot going on.
Oh, I mean, Tony, you mentioned there that there were sort of your English degrees and your history degrees that people can transfer from. Are you looking for, when people come on to do law, sort of like your written subjects for all the sort of the reading that you have to do, and sort of the academic studying that you have to do, and the reports you have to write? Are you looking for people who have got sort of that sort of background in A-levels, sort of the standard that you require?
Well, as I was saying, at Northumbria, I can't speak for other law schools, but at Northumbria, we will take any combination of A-level subjects. So as I say, if someone has done law, that's fine, but equally if someone hasn't, it won't make any difference to them, because I say we assume zero knowledge base. I would say that if you are seriously considering doing law at degree level, then if you have done something like English literature or history, I mean, I did English literature as an A-level student 30 plus years ago now, but that definitely helped studying law. You might not think there's an obvious connection there between English literature and law, but law does revolve around law made either by Parliament, so acts of Parliament, or judgments of the courts, some of which are very lengthy. So if you're going to study law properly and take it really, seriously, then you're going to be doing a lot of reading, and you're going to be working at kind of reading between the lines as well, looking for subtleties in the judgments, looking for maybe inconsistencies, things left unsaid, all the sort of things that you'll do if you're studying either history or English literature. English literature in particular, I think, is a really good one.
Yeah.
Because I say this to my degree students as well, that when you're reading a judgment and you're kind of picking it apart and looking for inconsistencies and ambiguities, and you're doing that when you're reading legislation as well, acts of Parliament, you're always looking to see if there's some loopholes that can be exploited. All the sort of things you'll learn when you're reading Shakespearean plays or Chaucer's poems or Dickens novels or whatever. It's exactly the same skill, believe it or not. So that's a really good one. And history as well, because you're going to be reading a lot of documents and again looking for lessons to be learned for the future, and that's again a skill that you can use as a law student. You might be reading a case from last week, or you might be reading a case from 300 years ago, so you're always looking to see what was the historical, social, economic, political context, and what lessons can we learn from that. So those, history and English, particularly useful. But I mean, if a student turned up having done maths, physics and chemistry at A-level, then they would be treated exactly the same as everyone else.
Yeah.
When it comes to enrolling on the degree.
I mean, I did A-level law and I did A-level English language, and I remember sort of rolling up from the first week, getting the textbook list, going to the library, getting the textbooks, and coming out with a pile of books that were like that. And you know, I read all the time, and that was still sort of not daunting, but it was a sort of an eye opener on how much you had to do. And I think if we're looking from a pupil standpoint, like you mentioned the English and history, there's lots of now at GCSE. There's all of the skills, the inference skills, the sort of the ambiguity, as you said, the sort of the finer details to point of what people are saying or what people are writing about, the context. They're well prepared for that at GCSE now. So I think, you know, we are building it up. So yeah, if we move to you, Martin, there's a question coming here saying, do you ever come away from a trial and think about the people who are involved? Like, do you ever feel guilty about sending someone to prison, or do you ever come away and think there was a nagging doubt that there wasn't enough evidence in a trial to convict someone, even if you have found them not guilty? I guess the question is, do you ever come away feeling frustrated?
I do come away feeling frustrated as well, but I've never come away thinking that a mistake has been made. Although sometimes I may disagree with the verdict, but as magistrates, we sit as a bench of three. So if two people agree and one person doesn't agree about the verdict, then it goes with the two people. And in court, we don't say who voted for what. It's just the presiding justice who will then tell the defendant what the score is. My frustration, and it's why I became a magistrate, is that I get very, very annoyed when people if I go back a little bit, some of your students will watch programs like Police Interceptors and Traffic Cops and things like that. And when you watch stuff like that and you see the mayhem that some people cause and the way that they treat police officers and members of the public, and then at the end, the commentator will say, and at the end of the day, there was the CPS didn't press charges or they got a fine or something like that. Members of the public must get really, really frustrated. Well, over 20 years ago, I was reading the local Mail. I was getting frustrated reading that people were doing all sorts of nasty things and not going to prison. So I thought, well, I'm going to see what the hell goes on here. And I rocked up to court. I sat in the back of the magistrate's court to see exactly what would go on. And as we went through the day, I got more and more frustrated. And when the court day was over, I sat there and I was really quite livid. And the chairman of the bench, before he went out, said, "Sir, you've been there for some time. Can I just ask you what you're doing?" And I said, "Yeah, I've just come to see justice being served in Hartlepool." And I said, "And I'm really frustrated." And he said, "Yeah, I see your point." I said, "Well, why haven't you sent these people to prison?" And he said, "Well, we get frustrated as well, but there's one thing that's stopping us doing that." And I was really quite cocky, like, "Well, what is it then?" And he said, "Well, it's the law." And it's absolutely correct, because the law will say what you can and you cannot do when people commit certain crimes. And the public doesn't really know that. And as a result of that, I became a magistrate, and I still get frustrated. And I get frustrated because there's a burden of proof. And in a criminal case, it's beyond reasonable doubt, or as we now have to say, just make sure that you know. And if the Crown Prosecution Service cannot prove without beyond reasonable doubt, then the defendant will walk free. And there are a number of times when myself and my colleagues are absolutely certain and know and are sure that the defendant committed the crime. However, the Crown Prosecution Service did not prove it. That's frustrating. That person we know is guilty, it has to be proved to be guilty. And if there's not the evidence and the evidence isn't presented properly, then that's it. And I think, perhaps as Tony was saying there as well, it's about reading, it's about having the language, it's about being articulate, it's about knowing what to say. It's about being accurate in the detail so that you can prove beyond reasonable doubt if you're a prosecutor, or with that detail and accuracy to make a doubt if you are the defense solicitor. And yeah, I'm frustrated sometimes when I know people are guilty, but it's not proved beyond reasonable doubt. But that's justice, and that's how it should be. Because otherwise, if you don't like somebody, you say, "Oh well, we'll send it to prison." Mm-hmm. And that's sometimes a big talking point in the retiring room when we've heard all the evidence. We really have to focus hard on this is what we've heard, although we believe the guy's guilty or the person's guilty, sorry, but this is what we've heard. Has it been proved beyond reasonable doubt? And sometimes it isn't.
And on that, Tony, would you ever want to become a magistrate based on Martin's frustrations?
Don't get paid.
It's not something I've seriously thought about, to be quite honest. I mean, one of my colleagues is a magistrate, so it is something you can do whilst working in a law school. They're not mutually incompatible professions, I guess. I don't know, possibly later on in life, I guess. But I've got more than enough to keep me busy at the moment. So maybe in the future.
I had a question this morning, Martin. I didn't include it on the agenda, but they said, are you ever scared to go out after you've sort of sentenced somebody to prison and then their family's there? Are you, obviously, you're talking about local crimes in local areas and sitting in a local magistrate's court. Are you ever worried about sort of bumping into these people late at night?
Well, no, I'm not. I think as a member of the public, you stick your head above the parapet and that's it. I often walk around the town or my estate and somebody will look at me and think, and I know them, and they'll think, I know you from somewhere. But they see me in my suit and my tie, they don't see me in my t-shirt and my shorts. I haven't a clue. They think, I know you, but where do I know you from? But then sometimes it would be, how do you do, sir? How are you, sir? You know, there is a certain amount of respect from people because the bench, I would hope, is very, very fair. And most of the naughty boys and naughty girls know they've done wrong. They know they've done wrong. And it's not everybody, of course. It's a very small minority of the population, but it's the same minority. So in communities, everybody knows who the naughty boys and naughty girls are, and sometimes they go out of it, you know, sometimes they don't.
I mean, your workload must be sort of through the roof because, you know, I spoke to this about my pupils sort of when we did sort of the criminal element of our module about how many cases you actually hear, because there's only like, is it 1%, Tony, 2% of cases go to the Crown Court?
It's about 95% of cases.
5% in the Crown Court, I would say,
About 5% go to Crown Court. 95% of cases are completed in the Magistrates' Court. I sit perhaps twice a week for a whole day in perhaps a remand court or a trial or different courts. But we can have as many as 30 different cases in a day. And in Teesside, there can be 5 courts running. So it's very, very busy. But the challenging, the serious cases, they all go to the Crown Court. If somebody in the Magistrates' Court doesn't like the result, i.e. they're convicted, and they don't like that, or the sentence and they don't like the sentence, they obviously then have a right of appeal to the Crown Court. And they can go in front of the judge and just say, well, look, I don't like that, and it can all start again.
So there's a question that's coming up next about how to become a magistrate, but then on the back of that, how do you go about being a judge? So I guess magistrate for Tony, magistrate for Martin, and then how to be a judge to Tony.
Well, anybody who's between the age of 18 and 70 can be a magistrate, although it's very difficult if you're a young person and you've got a job, because you need your employer to be able to give you time off during the day, and that sometimes is very, very difficult. The sad thing is that the average age of the bench in Cleveland is 58, 59 years old. And at the moment, we're trying to recruit more magistrates who are younger. The other sad thing is that the bench is predominantly white, and we need more ethnic minorities in for a balance, especially in the Middlesbrough area. The balance in the bench is probably about 50-50 male, female, but we're mainly white middle class, and that's not representative of the population of Teesside. Once you decide you want to be a magistrate, you would apply. You go through an application process. You go through quite a rigorous interview process, which is 2 quite rigorous interviews. And then if you're accepted, you get accepted by the Lord Chancellor. And then you would go through a training process, which takes at least a year. You can still sit through that process, but you're not fully fledged until you've completed a number of appraisals and are signed off by an experienced magistrate. So it can take 18 months to 2 years from application to the finish of the process.
And then on the back of that, Tony, is there a requirement to be a magistrate before you're a judge, or is it just through experience in legal work?
Well, I must admit, this is a subject I used to teach, but haven't taught for more than 10, could be 15 years now. So this wasn't on one of your list of questions, so I haven't brushed up on this. So I'm not, just bear with me if I'm not 100% accurate or 100% up to date on this one, but certainly what Martin was saying there about having to apply and going through an interview process and eventually being appointed is broadly same with the judiciary. Big difference is that whereas magistrates don't have to have legal qualifications, judges do. So certainly when I was teaching this subject area, there was a requirement that you had to be a qualified solicitor or barrister. Now I'd be surprised if that's changed.
Yeah.
Now you would typically start with a part-time judicial role, and I know a couple of my colleagues have actually taken on roles recently working for tribunals. So there's a couple of my colleagues working as tribunal judges, but there's another colleague of mine who's working as a part-time district judge. So they're combining those part-time judicial officers with their teaching commitments. My understanding is once you've gotten into the judiciary on a part-time basis, and if you want to make it full-time, you apply to become full-time and you work your way up from there. I suppose ultimately you work your way up and become a High Court judge, and then the Court of Appeal will be next, and then ultimately get a position with the UK Supreme Court. That would be the way to work it. Now, there are various exceptions to that. I know that some people have been appointed directly to the High Court or directly to the Court of Appeal. I think there's even one judge, I think I'm right in saying this, who was appointed directly to the UK Supreme Court. I'd have to check that. But most judges start off at the lower end as district or circuit judges and work their way up. But unless my knowledge is completely out of date, there is a requirement that you not only have legal qualifications, but you've actually been a solicitor or barrister first, and then you work your way up from there. And there's a body called the Judicial Appointments Commission who was set up, would that have been, must be 20 years ago, approximately, and they're heavily involved in coming back to what Martin was saying there, their role, amongst other things, is to diversify the judiciary. So I know when I started teaching law at Northumberland, with the judiciary being, and the phrase was pale, male and stale. So white-skinned, male, and shall we say not the youngest members of society. So that was the perception, and the Judicial Appointments Commission was set up 20 plus years ago to try and address that. And certainly the judiciary has diversified. There's a far greater proportion of women joining the judiciary. I mean, the 3 colleagues that I mentioned who are now judges, all female. So that's an insight, I think, into the way in which the judiciary is diversifying, and I think it is becoming a younger profession as well. But there's still a problem with a lack of ethnic minority representation. That's definitely true.
Good.
Just to clarify about district judges, a district judge is a judge in a magistrate's court. A district judge sits alone in a magistrate's court, but has the same powers as a magistrate. A district judge is qualified and gets paid about £110,000 a year. So it's a canny job, but they sit alone. Now, if you look at Crown Court judges and say a trial in a Crown Court, who makes a decision on guilt in a Crown Court? Well, it's not the judge, it's the jury. So the jury makes the decision on guilt in the Crown Court. The judge will direct them and then sentence. In a magistrate's court with a bench, there are 3 magistrates, and they will make a decision in respect of guilt and then sentence. In a magistrate's court with a district judge sits by themselves and makes a judicial decision on guilt. So bizarrely, the most powerful judges would seem to be sometimes the district judge, because they're the people who just sit by themselves and make decisions. In the Crown Court, the part-time judges, I think that Tony was alluding to, I think they're called recorders initially, the junior ones, and they can be solicitors and barristers, become recorders, and they'll sit on a part-time basis. Bizarrely, the chief judge in the Crown Court, say in Teesside, is called the recorder of Middlesbrough. So you get a recorder at the bottom end and a recorder at the top end. But from the recorder at the bottom end, part-time, you go full-time, and then you work your way up, as Tony was saying. Very, very good jobs. I sit in the Crown Court as a magistrate on appeals, and I sit with a judge, and it is absolutely fascinating. Everyone I've sat with at Teesside has an intellect the size of the moon. They are very, very clever people, very articulate, lovely people, mainly male, all white as in Teesside, but there are a couple of female judges there who are really good, but all very, very good, know exactly what they're talking about, very, very polite. But, you know, paid for what they do, very, very important job and very responsible job, but they work very, very hard.
So on that,
actually, Darrell, just one thing. Now that I had an opportunity to think about this, I'm pretty sure that the rules on people becoming judges might have been relaxed in the last year or so. Because I recall a conversation with a colleague of mine who did say that I should think about applying for a judicial post. And I think, I said, I've spent 20 plus years teaching law, but I'm not actually a solicitor or barrister. And I'm sure she was saying that's not actually a requirement anymore. So I think legal qualification is still a requirement, but not actually having practice. I would have to double check that, but I have a feeling that is one of the relaxations that have been introduced recently to try and further diversify the judiciary. So,
yeah, I mean, certainly something for us. We can let our pupils sort of go away and research that and come back to us at some point.
Sure.
They can do the donkey work. So you said, Martin, that you've sat with judges in the Crown Court, and obviously, Tony, you've taught for 20 odd years. And I know we had this conversation the other day about your most memorable case or something that stands out to you. I know we can't go into sort of the finite details, Martin, of the who's and what's, but is there a case that sticks in your mind that you've remembered in your career?
For me, it's one that's quite recent, really. There's been a lot of them. The frustrating ones when you know somebody's guilty and hasn't been proved beyond reasonable doubt, they're sticking in mind because I get frustrated with that. There was a health and safety violation where somebody was badly injured a number of years ago, and we fined the company over £100,000. That was memorable. You can't do that in the magistrates' court now, but you could at the time. But the most recent, and it got a bit of publicity a couple of weeks ago, was the appeal to the Crown Court by a man who had spat at a police officer and said, I'm going to give you the coronavirus here. And he appealed against his sentence. And I got a telephone call one day from the people who organise the sit-ins and said, can you go to Teesside Crown Court and sit on an appeal? So I did, and I turned up, and I was sitting with the Recorder of Middlesbrough there, who's the senior judge. And it was the guy who was appealing his sentence, and he was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for assaulting an emergency worker, and that assault was a spit. So spitting at somebody is assault. And it's serious if it's an emergency worker. It used to be assault PC, police constable, but there are a lot of other emergency workers now. So it's now assault of an emergency worker. And he got 6 months for screaming and shouting that he was going to pass on the virus and spat at this police officer. He also hit another police officer and got 4 months for that. So it was making 10 months in total. He appealed against it because he'd shown a lot of remorse. There were no similar offences in his history. He hadn't offended for lots and lots of years, and he'd given an early guilty plea. But if you give an early guilty plea, the guidelines would say that whoever's sentencing must give credit for that guilty plea. And it's usually a third off the sentence. So he didn't get the credit for the guilty plea because it shouldn't have been 6 months, it should have been 4 months. And it shouldn't have been 4 months, it should have been 3 months, theoretically. But, and I can only presume it must have been a district judge, was, I believe, absolutely correct in saying, well, look, this was a really very, very serious offence in very, very challenging times. And the public and the emergency services must be protected here. So this whole thing was done not live in the court. The judge and I were in the court. The court associate was there, and the usher was there. Everybody else was on Skype from the prison, from the CPS, from the solicitor's office, and from the local newspaper as well. So it was still being reported. It worked well, the technology worked. But in the end, the judge and I had to have a discussion about this. And the judge was quite clear that he felt, as I did, that the sentence for 6 months was absolutely correct, given the circumstances. And the sentence for 4 months was absolutely correct, given the circumstances. However, because there was remorse, because there were no similar offences, because there were no recent offences, and because it was an early guilty plea, what the judge decided to do was to make the 4-month sentence not consecutive to the 6 months, but make it concurrent to the 6 months, making, instead of a 10-month sentence, a 6-month sentence. This was reported in the local newspaper, and I think all hell broke loose.
I mean, was he sentenced for actually carrying the virus, or was it the perceived threats?
The threats.
The threats.
The threats. The threat is because he just, absolutely off his head. But it was out of character, theoretically, for this guy to have done what he'd done because he was just drunk. But given the times, it was very, very serious. However, no matter how serious it is, the judge felt that, and I have to agree with him, the judge felt that you should still take into consideration the other things that you should normally be taking into consideration.
Sure.
So the sentences stayed. There's no change to the sentences at all, except instead of being consecutive, they were concurrent. So he'd still do 6 months in prison, which means he'd serve 3.
Yeah. I mean, on a teaching standpoint, Tony, if he was carrying the virus there and he spattered someone and infected someone, would that sort of aggravate the offence a little bit?
Well, I mean, we had a debate about this, obviously online. About a week ago, there was a case where a British transport worker has died very sadly, but there's been an allegation made that somebody, and I believe the police have not arrested them, but have been interviewing somebody apparently coughed in her face and also coughed in the face of a colleague, and indicated that he had the virus and he was trying to infect her with it. And as we know, she subsequently died. And we were just debating amongst my colleagues and myself what possible crimes that would be. And we were discussing the possibility of murder as being the most extreme, well, the most serious offence, I should say. But the problem with murder and also manslaughter on these facts is you have to prove that the death was caused by the defendant. Now, proving a causal connection, given that there's every possibility that the victim here could have been infected by someone else or by simply touching a surface. I think a half-decent defence lawyer would easily be able to say, well, there's no chance of proving beyond reasonable doubt that it was this defendant who infected this victim. So we were exploring other possibilities. There's an attempted murder we considered, but that requires proof. As Martin was saying earlier on, it has to be proof beyond reasonable doubt. Attempted murder requires proof of intent to kill. We thought that's going to be difficult to prove. So I think what we eventually came up with is if this man is ever charged and goes to court, then what we think is it will be attempting grievous bodily harm with intent. That's what we're going for, which is a very serious offence. But that it avoids the causation problem because you don't have to prove that the virus was actually transmitted from the defendant to the victim. You just have to prove that the defendant intended to infect the victim with the virus. So if the evidence emerges that he did have the virus, or even if he didn't, but thought he did, and his intent was to transmit it to her by coughing in her face, then we think there's a pretty good chance of a conviction there, and that's a very serious offence.
Absolutely, that sounds about right, I think.
So I watch this space. The last I heard is that someone had been identified as being the perpetrator and was being interviewed under police caution. That's the last I heard.
Fab. I mean, aside from that, Tony, do you have a sort of memorable, or I know you've seen several cases in your time.
Yeah, well, I think that when you sent that list of questions over, this was probably the hardest one, to be honest. I have narrowed it down eventually to one, and funny enough, some overlap with what Martin was saying, because there's a case where the defendant was not drunk but high on drugs. It's a case called the Crown and Littman from the late 1960s. Darryl, you're nodding in recognition. So the case was very much of its time. It was the late 1960s, September 1967 to be exact. An American national who's holidaying in London called Bobby Littman. And the story goes that he meets a young French woman called Claudie Delbar in a nightclub, and they go back to her flat in Chelsea. And what happens next, only Bobby knows for certain. His version of events is that the pair of them took LSD, so a powerful psychedelic drug. He then remembers nothing until waking up several hours later. Tragically, Claudie is dead. He's strangled and or suffocated her with the bedclothes. The next thing he does is leg it out of the flat, head off to his hotel, grab his belongings, stuff them into a suitcase, jumps on a plane out of Heathrow and hightails it off to America. Claudie's body is then found about 3 days later. Obviously, there's a murder investigation launched. Scotland Yard are involved. It takes a long time before they eventually track down Bobby Littman as their prime suspect. He's now in America. He has to be extradited back to the United Kingdom, which he resists, but eventually he's brought back to the UK, and he faces a murder trial at the Old Bailey in central London. And he pleads not guilty on the basis that he lacks the mental element of the offence. I don't know whether your students have had a look at.
Yeah, we've touched upon the sort of the mens rea.
We touched upon this, right?
Yeah.
So murder requires proof of malice aforethought, and that means intent to kill another human being or intent to do grievous bodily harm to another human being. Now, what Bobby says is that whilst he was in this LSD-induced state, he was having a bad acid trip, and he says that he was somehow sucked down into the center of the earth, which opened up, and there he was embroiled in a fight with gigantic fire-breathing snakes. And in fighting them off and in saving his own life, he inadvertently killed poor Claudie. And the jury accepted that. So he was found not guilty of murder, but found guilty of manslaughter instead, on the basis that he didn't have the mental element required of murder. He appealed his conviction to the Court of Appeal, but the Court of Appeal confirmed that if you kill somebody whilst in a drug or drink-induced state, then at the very least you're looking at manslaughter, if not murder. So there you go, the case of Bobby Littman. That's possibly the most memorable of every case I've ever come across.
Sounds like some of my pupils' defences sometimes, and I couldn't do it because of this or that. Or I mean, if any of them go ahead and use that device about being stuck to the centre of the earth, forget it. Right, if we move on, question to you, Tony, about getting into sort of law work, about the law being oversaturated. About, I mean, how many pupils do you get sort of each year into university?
Oh, right. Well, our intake is about 400. And in Northumbria, we run 2 law degrees in parallel with each other. So there's a 3-year law degree, the LLB, which is very similar to what just about every other law school in the country runs. We also run a 4-year program, which takes, obviously, the students a stage further. They get a master's degree at the end of it, but more importantly, it exempts them from having to do either the legal practice course or the bar professional training course afterwards. So that students who graduate from our 4-year program can go straight into a training contract with a law firm or a pupillage with a set of barristers' chambers. Whereas the students who are doing the law degree don't necessarily want to go into legal practice, but they're interested in the study of law itself. And the way it works, students can transfer from one program to the other. So if a student starts on the 4-year program and decides after 18 months or so, or a couple of years, that maybe working as a lawyer is not really for them, they can switch to the 3-year route. But the reverse is true as well. So a student who starts on the 3-year route and maybe they just want to keep their options open at the beginning, then thinks, I really, really like this, I can see myself doing this as a career, they can then switch to the 4-year program. The students who stay on the 3-year program, they can go off and do anything, I suppose. I've noticed a lot of students go into teaching, funny enough. So at all sorts of different levels. I mean, I know former students who are now primary school teachers. Plenty of my former students are teaching in high schools or in colleges. So teaching is a popular destination for all LLB graduates. But those students that complete the 4-year program, then I would say a very high proportion do go into legal practice. Whether it's with a firm of solicitors, which is obviously where most lawyers are employed, or as barristers. And the Crown Prosecution Service, I've noticed, quite a lot of our graduates are working for the CPS now. So it's lawyers, it's a broad, it's not just a single profession, it breaks up into lots of smaller professions. So we have high street firms where the students are maybe advising on property disputes or helping people resolve matrimonial problems or divorces, or people dealing with employment disputes, that sort of thing, right up to former students of mine who are working for big corporate law firms in Newcastle or further afield in Leeds or London or in New York. I saw a post on, there's a website called LinkedIn. I don't know whether any of your students are attached to it, but I encourage all of our students to get involved in it. It's a kind of professional social networking site. And I saw just a couple of days ago, a former student of mine has just passed the New York bar exam, so she's going to be a lawyer in New York City. But that, you know, so I was saying, lots of students are now barristers. A former student of mine graduated just last year. She's starting a pupillage down in London. And I say the Crown Prosecution Service are taking on quite a few of our former students. So I think I wouldn't say the market is saturated, because you can use a law degree in all sorts of different ways, and you can export it. So, you know, you can work in all sorts of other countries. So there you go.
It takes you around the world. I mean, Martin, you touched upon sort of why you wanted to be a magistrate, but did you ever think about doing sort of any legal training before that, or whilst you've been a magistrate, if you wanted to take up legal training?
I don't know. I've been a teacher all my life, and if somebody said to me, "If you hadn't been a teacher, what would you have been?" And I would have said, "Well, before I get to know people in the legal profession, it would be something that, if I'd had the brain to do it and had the inclination, I think I would really have liked to have gone that way." I've got a huge respect for all advocates, but especially judges as well. They're just amazing people who are very, very responsible for their jobs. I don't think I could have done it, but interesting. But I do enjoy being a magistrate, although I have to leave next year. That's a bit of a shame as well, because you have to give in when you're 70, and I just feel as though I'm getting into my stride now. But it is what it is.
And same question to you, Tony. What made you sort of take up a career?
Well, that is a good question. I must admit, when I left college, doing a law degree is not something that had occurred to me at the time, and I actually went off to university to do an English literature degree, having done English literature A-level. I was talking about that earlier on, and just never got into that. I didn't enjoy it at all. But the university where I went, they actually ran law as a subsidiary module in year one. So that was my first exposure. I'd never studied law before, but I had to pick a subsidiary module at uni and pick law, and instantly enjoyed it far more than the main subject that I was supposed to be doing. So to cut long story short, I dropped off that course, and actually worked for a couple of years while I made a decision about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I thought I really should give law a crack. So I was actually 21 when I went off to university and to start my law degree. So 3 years after most students start their degrees. So I was 21 and went off to it was Leicester University, and just instantly loved it. But I said I've never thought about law as a career, even at this point. But I know that most of my fellow students at the time were all aspiring solicitors, so I got kind of carried along with that. And I remember between my second and third year, I did apply for training contracts to start after the degree. But then I thought, yeah, really, I'm not convinced that's the right sort of job for me. And the more I researched it, the more I thought, I don't think this is really for me. But what I was thinking is that I really loved being a law student. So eventually I went to see my guidance tutor. This was about halfway through my final year at university, and said, how do I get to do your job? And his advice was, well, finish your law degree, obviously, and then do a master's degree. So I did that. So I graduated from Leicester, and then I did a master's degree at Newcastle University. And within a few months of that, spotted an advert in the Evening Chronicle, when the Evening Chronicle was still widely circulated in paper format. And I was still living at my mum and dad's house at this point, having recently graduated, not having a huge amount of money. And my mum and dad used to get the Evening Chronicle delivered every day. So sure enough, in the jobs section one day, Northumbria University were advertising for 4 lecturers to start in the autumn. And so I applied, and as luck would have it, got one of them, and I've been here ever since. So I wouldn't say I've stumbled into legal academia, but it was never a career plan. It was a question of going off to university to do something totally different, and finding law offered as a subsidiary subject, and ended up studying that. And then going off to university to study law, and ending up deciding not to go and do any of the legal professions, but becoming a legal academic. But so, okay, there wasn't a grand plan, but it certainly worked out. As I'm coming up to 26 years at Northumbria now, and I've enjoyed, I wouldn't say every single minute of it, but I mean 99% of the time I've absolutely loved it. So it's all worked out well in the end.
Absolutely. I mean, there's some advice in there on saying if you've set out to do something and it's not quite for you, that there is opportunity to change, and there is sort of a path for you to go on, and sort of, you're not restricted by the choices that you make at day one. You can sort of alter your course, and it does work out well for you in the end. Well,
yeah, I mean, I would guess about once a month or so, I get an email from a former student who says there may well be solicitors or barristers by this point, but for some reason then it's not the career for them, or maybe it's not the career that they thought it was going to be, or I don't know what, maybe the opportunities for a promotion aren't there, or something like that. So every now and again, I'll get an email from a former student saying, how do I do your job? So I'm now the person getting asked that question, whereas nearly 30 years ago, I was the person asking the question. And the answer is very similar to the answer that I was given back in 1992, which was do a postgrad degree. So to get into academia, if anyone is thinking about that, then the advice is do a degree in the subject that you're interested in, and then go beyond that and do at least a master's, if not a PhD, because that's what Northumbria is asking for now, for people joining the staff to have not just completed a degree in their chosen field, but who have at least started on a postgraduate course, because the emphasis on research is huge now. So it's not just a question of knowing the subject and being able to teach it. It's you need to demonstrate at least an ability to conduct research. So that's a big, very much a big deal these days.
I mean, we had this conversation the other day, didn't we, about not choosing law because it was easy, or because it was less time than sort of any other degree. It's a case of you've got to be interested, because the amount of work that you have to put into it, it's not going to come sort of easy to you. You've got to work for it. It's not going to be a free ride. And I think, we need to be aware of the fact that choosing A-levels, choosing degree choices, there is an element of hard work in there. It's not going to be given to you for free. But at the same time, if it turns out it's not for you, then there's no harm in sort of altering your path and changing what you want to do, or what you thought you wanted to do in the first place.
Well, yeah, and I was saying earlier on that one of my jobs at Northumbria is to run a program called the Graduate Diploma in Law. So this is like a 1-year conversion course for students with a non-law degree. And it allows them to get in a position that anyone who's done a 3-year LLB would be in. I mean, having said that, there are massive changes coming down the line for the legal profession. The Solicitors Regulation Authority, the SRA, announced a couple of years ago now that they were going to dispense with the legal practice course and replace it with something called the Solicitors Qualification Exam. And that's due to start in a year or two's time. The SRA keep pushing the start date back. But it looks like eventually the legal practice course will disappear, and this new Solicitor's Qualification Exam, or the SQE or SQE for short, will replace it. That's designed to be much more flexible. That's the thinking behind it. That's the rationale for the reform, and it's to allow people who won't necessarily even have done a law degree to go into the legal professions. So it is designed to coming back to what we were talking about earlier on, to kind of diversify the profession and open it up to a much broader socio-economic demographic than has previously been the case.
All right, if we move on to our final question, how has the current COVID-19 pandemic affected your day-to-day roles? Martin, if I'll come to you, because you've had lots of time to think about whilst we've had a discussion.
Yeah.
How has the courts found sort of the current the pandemic, and how are you overcoming any problems that you are facing?
It's had a huge impact. Crown courts have until quite recently been closed, and apart from remands, there are, I think, 4 Crown courts around the country now being open for jury trials, because of course social distancing for juries, not just whilst listening to the evidence, but also in the jury retiring room, we couldn't do in the normal rooms, in the normal courts that we've got. So in the courts that are open, we're using 3 courts, one for retiring room, one for witnesses, so that's on a video link, and one for the jury and the judge and what have you. So it's quite a big thing there. In the magistrates' court, the district judges have been, because they're the paid magistrates, the district judges have been doing most of the work. But again, most stuff has been cancelled, so it's only been remands when people have offended overnight or something. They come in and then they're remanded, or they're sent off to wait for a trial or probation later on. They've been doing that until quite recently, anyway. I've just got a notice to say I'm sitting next week, and there are going to be trials in the magistrates' court now, as long as there are no more than 3 witnesses. The courts are being mapped out so there can be social distancing for everybody, and if not, then it's going to be through a video link and what have you. So people are working hard now to get the judicial system back on track. My understanding is that there are 400,000 outstanding cases now. So the backlog is going to take years to get through. It just shows how busy the courts are with a minority of people. And it's going to be really difficult. It will change the way that the judicial system works. It's been changing for a couple of years now. There's been a lot more use of social media. In the magistrates' court, there's been a single justice procedure where a magistrate, not a district judge, sits by themselves with a legal advisor and deliberates over things like traffic cases where the defendant has pleaded guilty. Ultimately, I think the magistrate will disappear, and it will be an algorithm. You'll get caught for speeding, you will go online, you'll accept that it was you, you'll be told how much the fine is, how much the costs are, and you put the credit card details in, and you pay, and then you get 3 points. Or how many points, or whatever it is. There's going to be a lot going that way. Some of the very basic stuff, I think, will be done online or with a single justice. There's just so much to do. The Crown Prosecution Service it's all about funding, have found it very difficult recently because there just aren't enough prosecutors. And as Tony was saying, they've just started recruiting now. So fingers crossed, that would be good. But there's a huge backlog in the magistrates' court. Before the virus, before lockdown, we were looking at trials 3-4 months ahead, booking the trials, which is no good at all, especially if somebody's remanded in custody. Because they're remanded in custody, and by the time they get the trial, they've served the sentence that they may get. And what happens if they're found not guilty? It's a bit of a challenge at this moment in time, but it will change the way that the judicial system works in the future. people are really thinking hard about making it more effective and more efficient. How that goes, I don't know, but something has to change.
I mean, Tony, you'll be in the same sort of position as we are, doing lots of distance learning. But how has it affected your sort of final year students who are doing dissertations or?
Well, the dissertations hasn't been too bad, because when was the lockdown? Sort of mid-March. I mean, most students were told they needed to have pretty much done all their research, and they should be in the final writing up stages by that point. Although normally we would have several meetings, face-to-face meetings in my office in the run-up to submission day, which is actually tomorrow, funnily enough. But obviously that's not been possible. So I've been dealing with a lot of email traffic. But I think dissertations are okay. That's not been too bad. We had to make a number of changes to our exams. That was probably the biggest change we had to make in the short term. Because obviously we would normally be having, on the first year of the program, 400 students all sitting in large exam venues on various buildings around the campus. But of course that's not possible. The campus is on almost total shutdown. So we've moved a lot of the exams online. We didn't do what the government told students in colleges and schools to do and scrap A-levels and GCSEs. We've kept all our exams, but we've moved them online instead. So one of the modules that I teach, the exam was on Thursday of last week. And so we made it available on the university's intranet site, and the students logged on and were given a set amount of time, which was longer than they would normally have. And then they were given a deadline by which they had to submit their typed up answers, so no written answers anymore. And so they're now sitting on a corner of the university's intranet site, and I can log on and mark a few papers electronically, and I'll be doing that. So hopefully all of those students will be able to complete their degrees and they'll graduate. There's not going to be a graduation ceremony, which would normally be in about 5 or 6 weeks from now. So that's not going to happen, at least not on time. We hope to be able to hold a ceremony maybe in the winter. So we're looking into that. Looking further afield, the new academic year is due to start for brand new students on the 21st of September and returning students a week later. And the university's vice-chancellor issued a statement just a fortnight ago saying that the plan was to reopen the campus to students. It's currently shut down for students and staff, for that matter, in September. Now, whether that actually happens or not, I guess we will find out, but that is the plan. To be honest, I can't see lectures going ahead, though. I mean, the idea that in September, I mean, what's it now, end of May? So in 4 months' time, I can't imagine being stood where I normally would be stood at the end of September in a big lecture theatre with 400 students in it, all sitting literally shoulder to shoulder, because there's 400 seats in the lecture theatre. That's not going to happen, clearly. But fortunately, over the last few years, we've been recording lectures as a matter of routine. So we have a bank of recorded lectures. So we'll hopefully be able to use most of those. So the students will be able to log on online, sitting at home in their bedrooms, wherever that happen to be. They can watch a lecture. And then as far as seminars and workshops are concerned, we might be able to bring in a small number of students, maybe 5 or 6 at a time, into a 30-seat seminar room and do that. But it may well be a case of sessions not unlike the one we're having right now, where I'm sat at home, the students are sat at home, and we're having a virtual discussion. So I think that's probably going to be the case. But as I say, optimistically, we are looking to reopen the campus to at least some students, maybe not all at once, but at least to some students at least in September. So that's where we're at the moment. Good.
I mean, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today on behalf of me and my pupils. I'm sure they're going to find this riveting, and it's a platform for them to get their teeth stuck into in September. And those that aren't doing it, like Tony said, if there's no pre-requirement to have done law at A-level, so even if this takes your fancy now, you might want to think about it in 2 years' time when you start looking at degrees. there's certainly lots of avenues to think about.
Absolutely.
So I will thank you all, and thank you for your time.
No,
All right.
sir.